Hi, my name is Reed Silverne. Name of the show is Fed Pride. Reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker, retired, and proud of it. Last month, I did a show about the U.S. election, and which, even though the pundits and the pollsters and the pollster averagers like Nate Silver of 538.com were absolutely positive that the Republicans were 63% odds or 63% chance of winning the Senate. I came out of a limb and said that the Democrats, who had a 36% and sometimes a 32%, depending on who you talk to or who you listen to, percent chance of winning the Senate would, or holding the Senate, would hold the Senate. Well, I was completely wrong. And I'm not going to make any excuses. There's no doubt about it. The Democrats got clobbered in sixth year of a presidency midterm, and on average, the president loses 7 to 9 seats. He lost 8, and there's one in Louisiana that's still up for a redo or a runoff between the two, and it's very unlikely that the Democrat's going to win that. That's Landrieu. And so the Republicans won 8 seats when they needed to only win 6 in order to get the Senate, and they won the Senate outright. There were a whole bunch of really close polls. And at the end, there were 9 seats that were within the margin of error. Of those 9 seats, 4 or 5 actually had the Democrat ahead. One of those was New Hampshire, where Shaheen was within the she was polling ahead of Rick Scott, who is a interloper and a carpetbagger from Massachusetts, running in New Hampshire. And basically, she did beat him, but not by as much as the pollsters thought. Even though it was within the margin of error and it was called a toss-up, North Carolina, Hagan was winning most of the polls, or ahead by 1%. There was an occasional poll where she was behind. The head of the opposition, the Republican, was the former Speaker of the legislature in North Carolina, which had passed a whole bunch of really unpopular things. The governor of North Carolina is very, very unpopular. There was some voter suppression, but it was thought that the get out the vote would overcome it. And even with most likely voters, the polls had Hagan up by 1% or 2%, or at the worst tied. And she lost big time. Actually, not that big, 49 to 47.3. But that's a difference of about 3% from what the polls were saying at the time. Shaheen won, Peters won, which is Michigan, but Snyder, the Republican governor of Michigan, who had pushed through the emergency manager law in Michigan against a referendum, or a proposition, an initiative that had passed with a big majority. The legislature immediately countermanded it, passed the same law over again, and was signed by the governor that basically set the stage for the declaration of bankruptcy for Detroit. Very, very controversial, and yet he won, and he won by quite a bit. Some of the most venal governors, specifically Rick Scott of Florida, He is famous for having been the CEO of a company that cheated Medicare out of $1.6 billion. The company, HCA, that he was CEO of, while he was CEO, pled guilty to a felony. I mean, I'm not sure how to throw a company in jail, but he had pled the fifth, something like 50 or 60 times during hearings and depositions over it. Yet he amassed a fortune of $500 million, used some of that fortune to run for governor. It was very unpopular as governor, and he was involved in other scandals, the worst of which was he privatized the Florida Medicaid system, which is basically health care for the poor. And the winner of the basically one bidder competition was his crony, his personal friend, a guy who had given his campaign money, and a guy who may have actually cut him in. Charlie Crist, the Republican turned Democrat, a former governor, very popular. He was running against Scott. Almost all the polls had it a toss-up, which means it was within the margin of error. But they had him up over Rick Scott, and he lost. Rick Scott won by about 1%, but it was a surprise to everybody because people thought that he was doomed. Again, in Kansas, poll after poll showed the senatorial race. The guy's name was Roberts. During the Republican primary, the Republican Senator Roberts was accused of having his primary residence in Virginia, not in Kansas, and long-term senator. And he basically was still a toss-up, but behind in the polls to an independent who was actually very popular, named Orman. And just going into the election, most of the pollsters had Orman up by 1%. Orman lost by 5%. So a lot of these contests were won by Republicans, and when they were expected to just be 50-50 or go off to runoffs or recounts and so on and so forth, and yet the Republicans won handily in a lot of these cases. In Arkansas, the Democratic senator, the son of a very famous Democratic senator. He had been a senator for quite a while prior. He was 3 or 4% behind, sometimes 5%, sometimes not. Lost by over 10%, and just got slaughtered, and just taken out and taken to the cleaners. A lot of these things were pretty much unexpected. Basically, the Republicans ran almost all of the toss-ups. They won in Iowa, and not by a little bit. In Iowa, there were poll after poll. Ernst was up 1%, 2%, sometimes 3%. Basically, the Republican internal polls had her way, way up. But everybody else, all the pollsters, just had it still a toss-up. A little bit ahead. If everything had gone through, she would have won by 1 or 2%. She won by 8.5%. And Iowa is a pretty moderate state. I mean, Iowa voted for Obama a couple times, and Georgia, Michelle Nunn, who was the daughter of a very, very famous Democratic senator from Georgia, the guy who actually started the START Treaty and passed all the funding and the Nunn-Lugar system, which basically set up our relations with Russia's and first Soviet Union, but mostly Russia, the Russian Federation, after the Cold War was over, and destroyed a lot of really dangerous, obsolete nuclear weapons on both the U.S. and the Russian side. Probably one of the great victories for the future of mankind in history. His daughter ran for senator against basically a new guy, Perdue, who was famous for having a company that outsourced, and he was head of Dollar General, which basically bought Chinese goods and flooded the markets with cheap Chinese goods. And during the whole rest of his career, basically outsourced like it was going out of style. In fact, he got an outsourcing award and had said, "I'm proud to outsource." And it was thought that neither side would hit the 50% mark and there would be a runoff. Instead, he won handily, 53%, 3% over the 50% mark to 45.1, basically by 7-8%. It ran up all right at the tail end. In Alaska, Begich lost. He was usually behind like 1%, but it was still a toss-up and could have gone anywhere. And some people thought that the Democrats could get the Native American vote out and so on and so forth. He lost by 3.2%. So basically, these things were surprising. As I said, in Arkansas, it was a toss-up, but toward the end of the thing, the toss-up, the Republican was ahead like 4 or 5%. It's Tom Cotton is a congressman, and he ended up winning by 17%. So the Republicans just blew away the Democrats, and in a lot of very unexpected ways. In Colorado has a mail-in vote. It seems like everybody who could vote had a very, very easy time voting. You got your ballot in the mail. All you had to do was fill it out and mail it back, or you could drop it off. You didn't even have to pay postage. You could drop it off at the polls, or you could even show up at the polls if you didn't get to it. Basically, in that case, Gardner, who's the Republican, big controversy over whether he was for personhood and wanted to ban in vitro fertilization, which is basically what personhood amendments do. There was other things on the ballot which should have brought the Democrats out. He won by 2.5%. And that was actually pretty close to what the pollsters said. The pollsters had him up by 1 to 2%, and he won by 2.5%. But it was surprising because the Democrats were supposed to have this great get out the vote, and they completely failed. I talked about Begich, Brownback. Brownback is the governor of Kansas, and it was thought that Brownback would take down the whole Republican Party in Kansas. Now, Kansas has voted Republican, especially for senator, for decades, but they usually voted for very, very moderate Republican governors, Republican senators, and so on and so forth. However, Brownback is just a raving Tea Party guy. Basically, in the previous legislature elections, dominated by Republicans, he set up a slate of Tea Party guys to run against the standard run-of-the-mill Republicans. The Republican establishment hated this guy. And he went out there and he just slashed taxes with the whole Laffer curve thing and said, if we reduce taxes, we're going to balance the budget. In fact, we're going to bring in more revenue and create jobs. Well, his state was trailing behind, during this whole recovery, trailing behind all of the states around it, Republican dominated or Democratic dominated. The economy was not doing as well as it could have been. The growth in jobs is way back. And on top of that, right before the election, it came out that they had gone from a surplus to $150 million deficit. And then the next week, the deficit was projected to be even bigger. And it was going to go on for 10 years. So cutting taxes reduced revenue, didn't increase it. It didn't create jobs. It didn't do anything but take some of the big players and the wealthiest people and reduce their state taxes. So the establishment Republicans were mad at this guy and all of his minions, and everybody else was angry with this guy. And he came back to win when he was behind an independent previously. So it was just kind of surprising. But when I look at the data, it's really not that surprising. And the reason it's not that surprising is because of voter turnout. In the election of 2012, the voter turnout nationally was 58.7%. So of all the eligible voters in the United States, 58.7% actually voted. And that number in 2014, when the Democrats had this great get out the vote and all of their people were calling and things were happening and independent organizations were bringing out the minority vote and so on and so forth, the voter turnout overall went from 58.7% down to 36.4%. So overall, a 20% decrease in turnout. So that's 20% of the total. It's more like a third of the voters that voted in 2012 didn't vote in 2014. And of course, if you figure that young people, minorities, and so on and so forth are the chief voting pool of the Democrats, that they voted in excess, or they didn't vote in excess of the Republicans that didn't vote in 2012. So, and in fact, in 2014, there were an extra 5.3 million eligible voters, voting age population at least. So in 2012, there were 130.3 million people who voted. In 2014, 82.6 million people voted, a reduction of 47 million voters when the eligible voter pool actually went up. So the vote just collapsed, basically. Some of the cases, Colorado, where a lot of people thought that Udall, who apparently, and my brother lives in Colorado, and he said Udall, the Democrat, was just the worst campaign in history. They had debates with the Republican. He lost the debate terribly. He didn't know the answers to what he was for and what he was against. But he still lost by maybe 1.7%. But either way, the voting percentage went down from 71% to 53%. Now in Colorado, they always had mail-in ballots. But in 2014, everybody got a mail-in ballot. Everybody, all they had to do was just fill it out and drop it off. And yet there was a 17% decrease in the voting, in the number of people that voted. Alaska, there's only a 4% decrease, and the independent actually beat the Republican governor, but Begich lost, and Begich had barely won the previous time, so that's not really that surprising. Florida, where Crist was ahead in the polls, and it looked like Rick Scott, I'm just going to come right out and say it, unindicted co-conspirator with his company to cheat Medicare in a state that has one of the highest proportions of seniors in the entire country. A guy who is and it will be investigated, and he may end up in jail yet for fixing the award of the privatization of Medicaid, worth billions and billions of dollars a year, a contract that's just gigantic, given to a crony who he had personal relations with, and who supplied his campaign with money and supplied him with benefits personally. I mean, a scandal that big occurring during the gubernatorial election. Crist was ahead in almost every poll, and yet lost by 1 or 2%, by a little more than 1%. Why? Because the Florida voter turnout went from 64% in the presidential election year 2012 to 43.1%. That is literally 1/3 of the people didn't vote that had previously voted in 2012. If they had all voted, would they have all voted for Crist and ran him out? Probably not. But a lot of those people, there probably would have been the margin of victory would have been in that 1/3 of the people in Florida that didn't get out and vote at all. So the Democrats have a serious structural problem. They can get out the vote in presidential years, and if they get that vote out and the voter turnout is 50% or more, just the way the Electoral College works and the number of electoral votes in the Northeast and the West Coast and some of these purple states, they have almost a lock. If the Latinos come out and vote in the same proportion as the African Americans, they could turn states like Texas, which is 30% Latino, and Arizona, which is 30% Latino. Arizona, if you count Native Americans and Asians and the other and African Americans, about 35% non-white minority. Georgia is a vastly increasing pool of Hispanic voters, citizens who can vote. So Obama listened to the Democrats that were running in very, very red states, and they said, please, whatever you do, don't push a executive order to legalize the parents of millions and millions of immigrant citizens. In other words, an illegal alien comes in 10 years ago or 5 years ago, has a baby inside the United States. That baby is a citizen, and they are not. They can be deported, and they have been deported in large numbers. So the big issue that's coming up is the Republicans have both the House and the Senate. Republicans can initiate an impeachment through the House, and they probably won't win it, but they could go through the same kind of cycle they went through with Clinton. and they're just up in arms in case Obama, and he probably will come out with an executive order basically granting work permits the way he did for the Dreamers, who are the non-citizen children who have citizen brothers and sisters, and basically give work permits to 5 million Hispanics who have 40 million voting relatives. Thank you very much. I appreciate your watching.